I'm a specialist in African affairs here at CRS, covering specifically East Africa, including Ethiopia, our topic today, as well as Nigeria and Chad. I'd like to thank our hosts, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, for convening this important discussion today and for asking me to moderate it. The title of this event, I think as you all saw from the invitation, Ethiopia, the Enduring Human Rights and Humanitarian Crises. And I'd like to thank our distinguished panel of speakers today for taking the time to be with us and to share their insights. Our speakers are joining us from sort of across the globe right now, including a number of locations in Africa. And so out of respect for their time, it's later there, but I sort of try to move things along as quickly as possible. It's interesting, a decade ago in 2016, the Tom Lantos Commission asked me to moderate a similar discussion on Ethiopia. At the time, there was an unprecedented protest movement unfolding in the country. It was fueled by repression, state repression, and grew, and it shook the foundations of the country's ruling Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or the EPRDF, which had been in power since 1991. And those anti-government protests ultimately paved the way for the rise to power of a new leader, Ethiopia's current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. Prime Minister Abiy, who had risen up through the EPRDF, promised to open up the country politically and economically. He loosened media and civil society restrictions. He released political prisoners. He invited dissidents to return from exile. He pursued peace deals with rebel groups and rapprochement with neighboring Eritrea. And he transformed the EPRDF, which was a coalition of sort of ethno-regional parties, into a single national party, which he called the Prosperity Party. But trouble was brewing. Intercommunal conflict in various locations across the country was driving rising displacement. And reports suggested over the years following Abiy's election in 2018, the political space was starting to close. In 2020, the government postponed elections that had been scheduled for that year, citing the COVID-19 pandemic. Tensions rose in Abiy's home state of Oromia, which is Ethiopia's most populous region. And they were also rising between the federal government and the TPLF, which had been the most dominant party in that EPRDF coalition. The TPLF was the ruling party in Ethiopia's northernmost Tigray region. Those tensions, by late 2020, obviously, I think everybody is aware, broke into armed conflict between forces in Tigray and federal forces, and involving regional security forces and militia from the neighboring state of Amhara and Afar, as well as the military of neighboring Eritrea. That war was, by some accounts, the deadliest war of the 21st century. It involved reports of possible famine and mass atrocities, including widespread and systematic rape and sexual violence, mass killings, and ethnic cleansing. An international commission of human rights experts on Ethiopia concluded that all parties in that conflict had committed war crimes, and that the federal government and its allies had committed crimes against humanity and used starvation as a weapon of war. The State Department issued its own atrocity determination after the fighting stopped in 2023 and reported similar findings. The peace deal that was signed at the end of 2022, or rather the Cessation of Hostilities agreement, it stopped the fighting between federal forces and forces in Tigray, but conflict continued in parts of Oromia, and a new conflict unfolded in Amhara. The conflicts in Amhara and Oromia have, since the CoHA was signed, featured also mass atrocities, reports of extrajudicial killings, reports of forced conscription by government forces and insurgent forces, reports of the use of child soldiers, and the increasing use of drone strikes, including against civilian infrastructure and hospitals. I think today we're going to talk sort of in more detail about some of those conflicts, and about the deteriorating relations between the federal government and authorities in Tigray. Ethiopia, as many of you know, recently had elections. Hopefully we'll also be able to touch on those a bit, and on the state of US relations. Without taking up too much time, I'm the moderator, not one of the speakers. I do want to turn it over now to our panelists. We're going to be joined today by Magnus Taylor, who is the Horn of Africa Department Project Director at the International Crisis Group, by Abdullahi, who is the Eastern Horn Senior Advocate at Refugees International, by Mahlet Geberdine, who is the board president of, Oromia Tigray, and by Jurga Gelau Woldes, who's an associate professor at Curtin University in Australia and the director of the Center for Human Rights Education. With this, I'm going to turn it over to Magnus to get us started on the political situation. Magnus.
Thanks a lot, Lauren. You actually promoted me there. I'm actually Deputy Project Director at Crisis Group, but thanks. I just want to make three main points about where I see Ethiopia politically and in terms of its conflicts today. The first one is that Ethiopia is increasingly politically centralized under a dominant party system under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The second point is that Ethiopia is chronically internally conflicted, and you mentioned the some of the conflict situations we have in the country right now. And the third one, which I think is sometimes slightly overlooked, is that Ethiopia is now existing in a incredibly strife-ridden region in which the regional strife is feeding into Ethiopia's own political and deadly conflict. And these situations within Ethiopia are also feeding into this regional strife. So it's kind of like a deadly circle at the moment, and I'll go into that a bit more detail. The first point on political centralization, as Lauren mentioned, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in a political transition in 2018, and since then, despite the internal conflicts mentioned, including the Tigray war, has managed to establish and possibly strengthen his position at the top of the Prosperity Party, which replaced the EPRDF. The recent national election that concluded in June, albeit an extremely flawed process in many ways, demonstrated that Abiy and the Prosperity Party's capacity to impose his political vision nationally and dominate the political landscape. The flaws in the electoral process are very clear for anyone to see. A kind of largely non-competitive process, a great restriction of political activity, the press, CSOs, but an election did happen in the majority of the country, albeit not in Tigray and parts of the Amhara region. And from a logistical perspective, the process was able to deliver largely what Abiy and his party wanted, which was an ability to say that we had an election and I was re-elected. The caveat for that, and we can touch on this a bit more later, is that Abiy is increasingly, as some people say, the mayor of Addis Ababa, presiding over an increasingly modernizing city, but unable to impose his political will at the local level in various parts of the country. So on to point two, that Ethiopia is increasingly or perhaps chronically a conflicted country. Most kind of conflict analyses of Ethiopia focus on three main regions in this respect. These are Tigray, the Amhara region, and also Oromia, but you could extend that into several other I guess, chronically conflicted regions as well, including the Gambela region bordering South Sudan, Beni Shangul Gumuz bordering Sudan, which has received quite a bit of attention lately, the Afar region, which borders Tigray, and parts of the Somali region as well, particularly the border regions with the Oromia region. So Tigray, I won't go into too much detail because we have another presentation on Tigray. But essentially, at the moment, we don't really have an active conflict, but we have a real sort of political standoff between the federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which in April this year decided that it wanted to reimpose itself formally over the regional administration, reformed a regional administration that had been elected in polls that were annulled prior to the Tigray war, and pushed aside the government-aligned regional administration that was in place before. There's a context to this, of course, due to disagreements about the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement that ended the Tigray war, and also continuing restrictions placed on the region, particularly economic, the non sending of the federal budget subsidy to the regional administration for several months, alleged restrictions of fuel and cash supplies to the region as well. So you have a situation now in which Tigray appears to have kind of de facto seceded from the federal system, albeit not formally, and is also, and I'll come to this a bit more later, pointing itself in alignment with Ethiopia's regional opponents, including Eritrea, Sudan, and even, if you go even more meta than that, Egypt as well. And the one thing is clear is that Abiy and his administration can't really go to Tigray. So one very important part of Ethiopia is now kind of out of bounds to the federal government. The insurgency in the Amhara region, which Lauren already touched on, began about 3 years ago. And it's another conflict that is connected to the desire by the federal government to centralize power in Addis Ababa, particularly the security forces. The conflict partly derived over the federal government's desire to disband all regional security forces, which then fed into the formation of a number of different militia forces around the Amhara region. These groups, I wouldn't say are necessarily a kind of major threat to the federal government beyond the Amhara region, but they control or they contest large rural areas, not so much urban areas, albeit they have controlled urban areas for short periods. At present, there's an attempt to create an umbrella political structure that will be able to coordinate different localized groups with the Amhara region, without a great deal of success for now. But whether that is something that can strengthen as time goes on remains to be seen. I would say that the Amhara region hasn't necessarily fallen to the Fano, but the writ of the federal government is highly contested in this region, and there are fears of the insurgency in the Amhara region and the sort of overlapping with the political the attempt by the TPLF to dominate the political space in Tigray as well, which would be of more of a concern for the federal government. Finally, moving on to Oromia, this is the longer running insurgency dating from just after Abiy came into power, from the Oromo Liberation Army. The government has had some success in tackling this over the years, both militarily and politically, including some negotiations that ultimately destabilized the movement and caused various splits within it. So the government would say that it's, essentially defeated the OLA, but the evidence suggests that in various parts of the region, particularly Western Oromia, Central Oromia, not too far from Addis Ababa, the capital, and also in some pockets in the eastern part of the region, the OLA is still active, and has there's created a kind of conflict economy in which there's a great insecurity, particularly connected to the practice of kidnap for ransom. So it's very difficult for many Ethiopians to travel within the Oromia region, which is a great change from the situation that it would have been 10 years ago when Lauren last presided over an event for the here. So Oromia is the insurgency is not necessarily an existential threat to the federal government, but it's created a great deal of insecurity in a region that is a really a driving force within Ethiopia nationally. So yeah, I think just relating that to the national political picture, Abiy may be a kind of political colossus that kind of bestrides the political scene, but in various parts of the country, he's not really able to venture into without a serious security escort, which tells you something about the state of Ethiopia at the moment. Moving on to my third point, which was about regional strife. Ethiopia is highly conflicted internally, but there are several other countries within the region that make this a very rough region to exist in. Ethiopia's internal conflicts are bad, but they aren't as bad as the continuing civil war in neighboring Sudan, which Ethiopia is now appears to be somewhat involved with. The war in Sudan is very destabilizing for the Horn of Africa region because it's created different blocks of countries that are supporting either the Sudan armed forces, and on that side, you would say Egypt, not a Horn of Africa country, but quite influential in this region. Eritrea as well, which is Ethiopia's long time antagonist in the region. And then other non-Horn countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia as well. On the side of the rapid support forces, you would say currently Ethiopia, the UAE, albeit the UAE denies any involvement with the RSF, and various other regional states that have also played a role in allegedly facilitating the delivery of supplies, weaponry, etc. To the RSF. Ethiopia was generally quite restrained in the early part of the war, but for various reasons in the last 6 months to a year has got more involved and now appears to have played some role in facilitating a major RSF campaign in a neighboring region of Sudan, Blue Nile State, which neighbors the western region of Beni Shangul Gumuz. And there's pretty good evidence that the RSF are operating and being supplied in that region. Why is this happening? Partly, we think this is happening because Ethiopia feels quite vulnerable in its northwest corner to its regional opponents getting involved with the TPLF in Tigray, particularly Eritrea and the Sudan armed forces. So part of the reason to push back against is to push back against the Sudan armed forces by getting involved, by essentially facilitating the RSF in a borderland region with Ethiopia. All these regional states, and this is a long-standing kind of historical process, appear to like to gain leverage over their neighbors in different ways. And this is happening now, whether it's in Tigray within Ethiopia or in Ethiopia's response to external involvement in Tigray through the RSF. Ethiopia also has a long-standing antagonism with Eritrea as well on its northern border. And much of its policy in the north is to be able to defend itself, to create a buffer zone against what it fears is Eritrean action in the north of the country. And finally, a lot of what Abiy's regional agenda is animated by his desire to end Ethiopia's landlocked status. It's the world's largest landlocked country by population size and gain a seaport on the Red Sea. There are rumors that he would like to do this through Eritrea, and previously there were attempts to do this through Somalia, which was also very diplomatically difficult as well. So this is a in summary, this is a highly conflicted region, and these conflicts are feeding into Ethiopia's own internal strife. So just to conclude, and I won't speak anymore because I think I've gone over. Abiy may be politically secure, but his country is certainly fraying at the margins, and his writ in various regions of the country is pretty weak. The region is fragile, and these rivalries in the region are feeding into more internal strife in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia's own internal strife is contributing to this regional instability too. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. We're now going to turn to Abdullah to talk about the humanitarian situation. And I want to preface this maybe sort of with an observation, and probably Abdullah will address this to some extent. We have, for the first time, I think this year, a situation in which the UN does not have a humanitarian appeal for Ethiopia. You cannot find an estimated number of how many people in Ethiopia are in need of humanitarian aid, much less a number of people in Ethiopia who are facing food insecurity or acute food insecurity. Does this mean that the situation has dramatically improved under Prime Minister Abiy? What's going on, Abdullahi? And then tell us what your concerns are.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to the commission, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Lauren, as always. I think the good place to start is with Magnus's analysis, where the downstream of the fragility within Ethiopia and the region, and the Horn of Africa region is not a region that is new to fragility. I mean, you can go back 20, 30 years. The 70s era of supporting, rebel groups and movements as a proxy inside the country, I think he's come back after a while of it, going down. I think, Lauren, what you touched on there, the downstream of the 2020-2022 conflict is what we are seeing. Ethiopia, particularly even before Abiy, but increasingly under Abiy, just feels like it doesn't need to share information or allow others to find information. Whether you're a journalist, whether a humanitarian actor, access is completely managed, extremely curated. The food insecurity piece came out just the other day, the report. There was no section on Ethiopia because Ethiopia refused to share. But all indications are between 13 and 15 million Ethiopians are facing acute food insecurity. But in certain areas, those numbers look like numbers from war times. If you look at particularly Tigray region, you see the malnutrition numbers of kids under the age of 5, pregnant and lactating mothers. Those numbers have gone through the roof. And if you take even the numbers aside, but anecdotally speak to people who are living there, what they will say to you is, look, Abdullahi, what the Pretoria Agreement did November 2nd, 2022 was it stopped the active conflict. But what we are seeing is an inactive conflict where food is being used as a weapon by Addis, especially against the Tigrayan, in the Tigrayan region. Relationships have not been better. And I think at the core of that, there are two things that I want to mention and probably say the third thing and pass over the mic to my colleagues. Number one is the question of the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The moment the peace agreement was signed, and that peace agreement, I think we can say with a fair degree of certainty, won't be signed without the United States putting all its diplomatic, humanitarian, and political capital on the table, pushing for it to be signed. But my sense is, as quick as the deal was signed, the signing of the deal was made an end in itself. It wasn't a perfect deal, but it stopped the bleeding. After that, the patient was just left there. No much has been done in terms of enforcing this peace deal. When, in absence of dealing with various aspects that were already problematic in terms of the drafting, then act as then started taking issues into their own hands. And I'll use two before I go to my second point. One is the return of the IDPs. In Tigray region, we have somewhere between 700, at least 700,000 people distributed around the 90 camp-like situation in the Tigrayan region. This particular group of people are being used as part of the political football by both Addis and Mekele. Mekele would not want to solve this problem or allow Addis to take credit for solving it. So the IDPs are finding themselves in that kind of situation. Then what is their living condition? With aid being vacuumed out of the system in 2025, the numbers in terms of the needs looks incredibly desperate. That's number one in terms of the application or the enforcement of the Pretoria Agreement. The second one touches on it touches on armed groups that are in Tigray region, especially in the western part. As long as they are there, there's not much that is going to happen. Addis has tried various means to really get to this, but because the alliance that led to 2020-2022 conflict has frayed, meaning some parts of Tigray now are aligned with Addis, certain parts of Tigray are aligned with Asmara, and that really doesn't bode well. But coming back to my second point after Pretoria Agreement, it is the question around the Joint Emergency Operation Program. The pipeline for this is going to break anytime soon if it hasn't. And this, on a good day, on a good month, supports something around 3.1 million people by food supplies through the United States. And the challenge really right now is, even if it is renewed, it has to be renewed. Even if it's renewed only until the end of this year, that is for the next 6 months, for next year, we will be staring at another funding cliff for this. So the United States ensured that the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed. The JOEP, that is the Joint Emergency Operation Program, it's been funding despite aid cuts. If this is not done and for foreseeable future, what you are seeing is Ethiopia is used to crisis. It can deal with one political crisis despite having multiple crises going on at the same time. It can deal with food insecurity if it is going on just alone. But currently what you're seeing is multiple crises going on simultaneously. You have the humanitarian crisis, you have got the political crisis, and it has diplomatic crises across with almost all the neighboring countries, save for Kenya. With Somalia, access to the port over Somaliland, that is a big problem. Tension between Somalia and Ethiopia. The only actor that will benefit is Al-Shabaab. Tension with Sudan, South Sudan, tension with, Eritrea, which is long-standing. So that is the environment within which you're seeing a cascade of humanitarian crisis, political crisis, all of them feeding off of each other. And that is what we have in Ethiopia. I think in terms of recommendations moving forward, and I'll keep quiet, one is the funding of JOEP will be critical in terms of stopping the suffering. Secondly, the United States, just the way it's put its political capital, diplomatic capital, and all the other capitals on the table to ensure the signing of a deal, albeit imperfect, I think the implementation of this deal will go a long way, not in bringing the political temperature, not just inside Ethiopia, but also in the region. I will cede my time and donate some of it for question and answer. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you, Angela. Just to sort of add a note on that, I was in Ethiopia in April and visited Mekelle. And what was striking was in visiting with some of the IDPs in the capital of the region, who were very grateful for the U.S. contribution through the JOP, which is managed by Catholic Relief Services. They were aware that the funding stream for this assistance was coming to an abrupt halt this summer. And they were very concerned about it. It appeared to be adding to the tensions which were already mounting between Tigrayan authorities and federal authorities. And I suspect we're going to hear more from Malik about what's been going on in Tigray, rising tensions, the reports of sort of a semi-blockade having sort of with federal forces encircling the region. When I was there, it was quite apparent that there was very little fuel in the region, the only vehicles on the road being electric vehicles, and sort of allegations that the government was restricting fuel access into the region. Malik, I'm turning it over to you. What can you tell us about what's going on in Tigray?
Thank you, Lauren. Most things we've talked about so far, what we're seeing in Tigray is that Tigray has not essentially recovered from the war. We've seen that post the signing of Pretoria Agreement that Tigray has been excluded politically. There's economic pressure, unresolved issues with displacement and IDPs. As we talked, almost 1 million IDPs are scattered all over Tigray. And then we're seeing the impunity and failure to really implement the Pretoria Agreement. For the displaced families that we're seeing all over Tigray, it means that they have spent another year, now over, close to 6 years, without a safe return path home. For the survivors of atrocities, we're seeing that there has been no justice, no pathway to justice that they can receive that's actually independent and focused on victims and centering the victims. Within the hospital, schools, local administrations, we're seeing civil servants serving without access to fuel, as mentioned, salaries, supplies. For the young people that are in Tigray, we're seeing them leaving in mass numbers, and they're being told to believe like in a political future. But that political future within the context of Tigray and Ethiopia is a region that they're living in with no access to a federal electoral path at all. This is not like an accidental instability that we're seeing post the signing of the Pretoria Agreement. What we're seeing is the result of choices by the Ethiopian federal government, by its allied forces, by political actors who are placing their power and factional survival over the protection of civilians and civilian rights, and also just withholding the agreements of the Pretoria Agreement that they've signed on to. As discussed here, like over the war between 2020 to 2022, we saw that Tigray was devastated by the war, which even like the African Union has classified killing over 600,000 people. UN investigators have documented the pattern of the killing, systemic sexual violence, all of the types of violations documented by all actors that we've seen within the Ethiopian actors, Eritrean actors, and documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, ICRI, and with even now, like the World Health Organization's finding that over 86% of Tigray's health facilities are damaged, and with only like 3% fully functioning. And to this day, like with all of these atrocities that took place, and even the signing of the Pretoria Agreement, not one senior like perpetrator has been held accountable. There hasn't been a justice process that we can bring to working groups within Tigray that are composed of survivors and include them into a transparent process where they can receive some form of justice. Within the Pretoria Agreement, it was supposed to move us away from like the horrors that we saw played out during the war. It promised not, us to into the hostilities, which we saw, like, guns stopped, but we were also supposed to see like restored services, hindered humanitarian access, withdrawal of foreign forces. And during that time, Abiy Ahmed's administration said they're committed to actually putting out and actually executing what the Pretoria Agreement was supposed to achieve. But what we've seen is that's only just been words and has not actually been implemented. Like I mentioned, IDPs are still scattered in over 90 camps in Tigray. Eritrean forces are remaining in border areas, over 1 million people still displaced. We still haven't seen any of the actual deliverables that the Pretoria Agreement was supposed to provide implemented. And what we've seen is Abiy just using that and saying, we have this agreement, we're going to do something, but actually doing nothing and continuing on with his dreams of a potential war again with Tigray being encircled, with continuing to work with other actors internationally, like involving Gulf actors, developing a differing geopolitical strategy for how to cripple Tigray and also act on his ambitions of a future potential war. Additionally, when it comes to the fuel that we've mentioned so far, prior to now, like it was about 12 to 15 million liters a month. But from early last year, it collapsed to about 800,000 liters. And since January, regional authorities reported that not even a drop of 1 liter of fuel was coming into the region. So even though Ethiopia is continuing to deny this allegation, deny that the fuel is not entering Tigray, it's very clear in what we're seeing in Tigray, like ambulances cannot operate. You're seeing like the impact in like the delivery, farming, markets, transport systems, when basically in the basic necessities of life that people need to function and do, have basic access to the services that they need, you see a complete collapse in the healthcare system and being able to access the resources that people need. And also even in the food aid, with 81% of food aid being limited for the more than 900,000 people that need it, but it's still sitting undelivered because trucks cannot run and be able to operate and provide this food aid to the people. So in terms of the budget also, like Tigray has been excluded multiple times from the federal budget for that regionally. Civil servants are operating, over 140,000 of them still haven't been paid salaries. They have back pay of over 16 months that they're supposed to be receiving back wages from salaries being frozen. It's been essentially unprovided to the civil servants. So not only is like Abiy Ahmed not working and his administration to actually implement Pretoria, work towards the peace process that they agreed to, they're continuing to further isolate the Tigrayan people from services, from access to humanitarian aid, fuel, etc. And then now, like we're seeing like political exclusion as well, which we've seen before, like with the elections that were mentioned, that Magnus mentioned. In 2021, Tigray was excluded from the electoral path. For the past almost 6 years, Tigray hasn't had any representation in parliament within the Ethiopian parliament. So not only are people excluded from other services, but they also have no say in the politics, no representation in Ethiopian politics. And then with the elections now, Tigray hasn't been represented in any of the elections. All of Tigray's regions were not represented. Tigrayans didn't get to vote. And that means with Abiy Ahmed's administration continuing for another 5 years, Tigray will be excluded at the end of this for at least a decade, 10 years of not having exclusion within the Ethiopian parliament. In other parts of Ethiopia as well, in Amhara region, we saw like about 8 out of the 138 constituencies would not be able to vote. And then it was actually noted after the election that over 30 was not able to participate in the election process. So essentially what we're seeing is regions that are opposing what Abiy Ahmed is doing or that are under authorities that maybe he has rivalries with, they're not going to get to participate electorally and have representation in parliament. So what we've seen just since the Pretoria Agreement implementation is the Tigrayan people are being squeezed and being decentered, being unable to participate politically, being able to have access to resources. And now what we're seeing is that has in turn led to the TPLF, also the signatories of the CoHA agreement, to oust the interim administration in May, take over the government, as Magnus explained earlier, and then from there start establishing their own administration in Tigray, and then basically establishing the pre-war council, which has been suspended since the peace deal, and whose own mandate has also expired. So we're seeing a council whose mandate has lapsed, where the Tigrayan people are not able to actually be a part of that transparent electoral process and actually elect and see what's, have a transparent system. But also that's being fueled by Abiy Ahmed's administration as well, with the continuous expulsion of the Tigrayan people politically, and the TPLF basically arguing that the fact that they have been excluded, that Abiy is not agreeing to the provisions of the Pretoria Agreement, has now forced them to want to take over Tigray and reinstate pre-war council, which in turn also does violate the Pretoria Agreement. and the Pretoria agreements, TRA. So essentially, right now, we're at a time in Tigray where what we're seeing is, as I mentioned earlier, youth fleeing the region in large numbers. We're hearing of youth being killed in Saudi Arabia and Yemen who are getting, into human trafficking issues where just in the past month in June, I believe 5 Tigrayans were executed in Saudi Arabia for just very small offenses. That essentially shows the larger picture of that youth are fleeing everywhere. And now we're seeing, conscriptions and potential war beginning within the context of Ethiopia and Eritrea. But all of this takes us back to the Pretoria Agreement. We are at this point in time, at this juncture, because the Ethiopian government has not implemented the Pretoria Agreement, has only committed to it in words, has not actually committed to it in actions. And what we're seeing is the continual, strangulation of the, political exclusion of the Tigrayan people, ability to have access to resources, fuel, humanitarian aid, the continual, basically exclusion of the Tigrayan people from having access to banking, humanitarian access to being free movement within the region is leading us to this point where we're now at the cusp of a potential other war where Tigray is encircled and IDPs have not been returned. The main provision of the Pretoria Agreement to return IDPs has not been accomplished. And now the Tigrayan people are left without any other path forward. And at a point where we actually have to come together to figure out how can we peacefully resolve the issues that we're facing. Turn it back to you, Lauren.
During the Tigray War, we saw a pretty significant contraction of press freedom in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia's rankings in press freedom indices have continued to decline since the end of the war. As a result, we see there are a few foreign correspondents left in Ethiopia. There was a Deutsche Welle correspondent, I think, recently expelled. Domestic journalists face threat of arrest, harassment, a lot of reports out there by press freedom groups about this. And as a result, the world, Ethiopia sees little reporting on conflicts that continue in the country, including the conflict in in Oromia, for which we don't have a panelist today, and the conflict in Amhara, which continues. I was just recently trying to find the latest numbers of IDPs, and similar to the situation with UN numbers on humanitarian need, we don't seem to have any reliable sort of current estimates on the number of IDPs from the Amhara conflict. And so, Jurga, you have the big task of sharing with us what is happening in Amhara and your views on sort of the situation more broadly. And I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. I'm grateful and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for including the Amhara voice in this platform. I have had this long-standing misgiving that Amhara voices were often excluded in many forums, but this is, I think, a good start. I want to share my points, but I just want to make one remark before I do so. When I speak about the Amhara situation, I speak from the position of the Amhara people. As someone from a human rights background, my interest is the experience of people. Often analysis about conflicts are presented by making politicians and institutions the units of our analysis, focusing on what numbers and statistics, but the human story behind it, the actual suffering of the people is often ignored. In that regard, I share the sentiment about the suffering of the Tigray people, the human rights violations that happened in Tigray. I myself had opposed the war, as many Amharas did. And that is a heartbreaking situation. The Pretoria peace agreement is good that it brought some sense of relief in Tigray. But I want to emphasize on few pointers, especially seeing the Pretoria Agreement as a peace deal and something that would resolve the conflict in Ethiopia as for me, a very dangerous approach to the situation in Ethiopia. I say this because in the Pretoria deal, the Amharas, which were part of or affected by the situation in the war in Tigray and Amhara and Afar, were excluded deliberately while they were ready to participate in it. The insistence to implement that deal is to further marginalize and make Amharas voiceless. And it is also, it will also result in further creating friction and fusion between Amharas and Tigrayans. There are contested territories between the Amhara and the Tigray people. These people have lived together for centuries before the rise of ethnic nationalism in Ethiopia. Once in our past history, the Amharas and the Tigrayans used to speak the same language, the Giz language. I grew up in Lalibela, where Aksumite kings have built churches. Amhara, Lalibela and others also doing the same in Tigray and other parts of the country. We have a very strong connection, and there hasn't been such a problem in our past. The crisis between the two regions have been created as a consequence of the political crisis that is created and has to be resolved by the involvement of these people. But the active silencing, disregarding, and exclusion of the Amharas will result in creating future violence and war between Tigray and Amhara. And I think the international community, especially the United States and others who are actively supporting the Pretoria deal as a peace maker, while they also know quite well that the Amhara are part of that issue, is really a very dangerous approach, and I hope everyone would revise that and consider Amharas as essential ingredient, part and parcel of that process. Having said that, I think it is also important for me to reflect on what is happening in the Amhara region at the moment. As someone growing, I was born and raised in a town of Lalibela. I hope most of you understand that holy, righteous place. I studied how to write poetry and philosophy from the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church scholars in that church. I learned how to respect my neighbors who would come to visit the churches, wash their feet when they come. The villages in Lalibela were called in different Ethiopian ethnic languages. For example, we have a place called Hadish Adday, which means like new mother in Tigrinya. We have a place called Takko, which means one in Lalibela. This is a place that instilled in me a sense of respecting other cultures and religions in the country. And I grew up as an Amhara in that place. But today, my people, the Amhara people, are actively subjected to different forms of violence that has not been paid attention to, especially by so many who should have done a better job. For example, just a recent BBC news report has documented and shown that since 2023, in just 43 health institutions, 2,697 women were subjected to rape. And out of this, 1,213 were children under the age of 18. The victims are as young as 8 and as old as 65. According to UNICEF, 4.4 million children in Amhara region have been out of school for more than 3 consecutive years due to this military campaign that is happening after the Pretoria deal. According to the Human Rights Watch, Ethiopian security forces have committed widespread attacks, amounting war crimes against medical professionals, patients, and health facilities. Amhara elected representatives, journalists, and activists who publicly oppose the violence were targeted and arrested. The Honorable Christian Tadele, for example, Amhara representative in the House of Representatives, Johannes Boyalo, journalist Maskarem Aberra, Gannet Asmamau, Gobezi Sisai, Wendosen Asefa, Tadio Stantu, and others are among the many thousands Amhara voices that are arrested on terrorism and other charges. Most Amharas did not participate in the recent election. These atrocities against civilians are countless, and they extend to assaults on foundations of their ancient Orthodox Christian churches. Monks, priests, and their disciples have been randomly killed in different parts of the country. For example, on the 25 May 2023, government forces bombarded the ancient Debre Elias Monastery, which was established in 1474. According to the European Center for Law and Justice, I quote, of the 600 monastery residents, approximately 570 were killed or injured. The monastery was deserted, with surviving residents forced to flee. On 8 March 2026, government forces attacked with heavy weapons the 15th century Atronesa Mariam and killed 7 Orthodox Christians and their priests who were attending a mass. The church was built in 1468 by Emperor Ba'da Mariam. In RC zone, for example, the violence against Orthodox Christian civilians, many of them Amhara, shows a sustained and escalating pattern rather than isolated attacks. From October 2025 to June 2026, reports by Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, the Amhara Association of America, and others documented repeated killings, attacks inside churches, the killing of priests and worshippers, beheadings and burning of homes, farms, and churches. The violence intensified around June 2026 election when the 101-year-old church, St. Gabriel Church, was burned on election day. This pattern points to targeted communal and religious violence that has received far too little international attention. Now, I cannot go on explain the details of these atrocities, but I just wanted to emphasize on a point of why this violence, which is really gruesome and brutal, is happening in Amhara with little international attention, and why are the Amhara people especially targeted within the Ethiopian political system and history. And I think it is really important first to understand how the Ethiopian state has been established since 1991. Since 1991, the Amhara have never had any political power in Ethiopia. In 1991, when Ethiopia was re-established as an ethnic-based system, the Amhara came out of, and other Ethiopians came out of, the 17 years of the Derg's brutal regime that killed the Emperor Haile Selassie and all his elected officials, that take all their land and made land the property of the state. And after the killing of all monarchical leaders and their taking of their properties, after 17 years of this violence, the Amhara people were invented politically as the ethnic enemy of all other groups in Ethiopia. And this history must be really understood very well. Ethiopia's major political actors still now, to TPLF and OLF and others, use the language of liberation fronts inherited from radical Marxist-Leninist ideology of the 1960s and the 1970s. The TPLF and OLF cast themselves still as liberators of ethnic nations from alleged Amhara domination. The Amhara is invented as a necessary enemy so that these political entities continue to claim that they are liberators of their own people. Whether the old imperial leaders were Amharas or Tigrayans, they were massacred and killed throughout the 17 years of the Derg period. There was no an Amhara ethnic class or group that had power from whom that power can be taken. But this narrative was politically convenient because Ethiopian leaders, including the present ones, use the Amharic language for their administrative purposes. But after 1974, and especially after 1991, as I said earlier, the Amharas did not have any political power. Yet the TPLF retained especially the Marxist-Leninist and ethno-nationalist frame, recasting Amharas as the historic enemies of Ethiopia's ethnic nations. Since 1991, Amharas have been branded Nefteñas, settlers, and colonizers, while killings, displacement, and dispossession against them have too often gone unmonitored and unaddressed. The Oromo Liberation Front and related narratives deepen this framing even further by depicting Amharas as colonizers In Oromia, Amharas have often been labeled as settlers, excluded from meaningful political participation, and denied services in their own language. Since 1991, decisive state power has rested largely with elites from Tigray and Oromia, not with Amharas. Yet Amharas are still treated as dominant political class. A new prosperity party narrative now appears to cast the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as an obstacle to national prosperity. This echoes the TPLF's earlier demonization of Amharas as enemies of other ethnic group sovereignty. Ethnic and religious demonization are now reinforcing each other, heightening the danger of further mass violence. With Amhara voices imprisoned, electoral participation restricted, humanitarian access denied, and violence ongoing, Amharas cannot have a meaningful political future unless their agency is recognized. A state order that treats Amharas as enemies while denying them representation and equal citizenship cannot produce peace. For this, I think the first responsibility of countries like the United States and the wider international community should be that the Amhara question must be fully understood. Amharas do not need another Pretoria-style deal that ends elite conflict while excluding affected communities. They need a decisive rejection of ethnic nationalist ideology that cast Amharas as enemies and made violence against them politically permissible. The Amhara crisis is rooted in long-term ideological demonization. Amharas have faced massacres, displacement, mass arrest, sexual violence, attacks on healthcare and education, electoral exclusion, religious attacks and denial of political agency, despite lacking decisive state power. International silence is dangerous. Unless the portrayal of Amharas as Ethiopia's enemy is openly rejected and dismantled, which is now represented in songs, in statutes, in constitutions, in many parts of Ethiopia. Ethiopia risks further atrocity, state fragmentation, and regional destabilization. The TPLF and OLF and other political actors must publicly renounce narratives that cast Amharas as historic enemies. Framing an entire people as enemies, settlers, colonizers, or obstacles to prosperity is a recognized pathway to genocide. Therefore, the US and international community should understand the Amhara crisis as a question of political demonization, exclusion, dispossession, and denial of agency, not merely as a security dispute over territory or a localized rebellion. International actors should publicly reject narratives that portray Amharas as historic enemies, colonizers, and settlers. The Ethiopian government should create conditions for peace and reconciliation with all parties, not just with few ones. There has been attempts to negotiate with the Tigray, the war in Tigray and Oromia, but no genuine attempt has been undertaken to engage the Amharas. And the Amhara forces as well have to engage in a meaningful dialogue and conversation with all parties without relinquishing the legitimate demand of the Amharas not to be seen and demonized in their own countries as settlers and enemies. And I think if we are to take this approach, which centers people's exclusion, demonization, and otherness, the solution for Ethiopia will not be far away from being realized. Without this, Ethiopia will further enter into an ongoing violence, discrimination, and possible genocide against the Amhara people. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuga. We've run out of time. I don't know if we have time for a final question. I will take the sort of prerogative of the moderator, not seeing any other questions. Jurga has just shared his recommendations, I think, for the United States. If our other speakers have thoughts, we've been in a process, the U.S. with the Trump administration, following on the heels of the Biden administration, of re-engaging with the Ethiopian government in 2023. The Biden administration lifted some of the restrictions on foreign assistance and on U.S. support for Ethiopia, the international financial institutions. And then most recently, last month, or in May, the Trump administration lifted the arms embargo restrictions on licensing for arms transfers, defense transfers to Ethiopia. The restriction prohibiting the trade benefits under the African Growth and Opportunity Act is still in place. Last year, the Trump administration, the State Department under the Trump administration, included for the first time Ethiopia on the list of countries using child soldiers, but it waived the restrictions fully under those sanctions. That's sort of the state of U.S. policy. There were recent bilateral discussions. There has been talk by U.S. officials of new investments in Ethiopia. Recommendations from our speakers for things that Congress, you'd like to see Congress do, if you can do it in like a minute. Let me start with Magnus since he spoke first. Magnus, anything?
Thanks. You put me on the spot there. You know, what can Congress do? I mean, for Crisis Group, we're a conflict-oriented organization, so you know our bar is set very low in a sense that in Ethiopia, to prevent the restart of deadly conflict in the Tigray region is probably our biggest policy aim at the moment, and we see you know, any significant US involvement at a more senior level that could somehow force or persuade both sides, particularly the federal government, probably to sit down and try and talk through a way forward and not start a new war, would be our very broad and possibly, you know, is this low-hanging fruit, or is this just what we feel is, you know, achievable at this time? So, you know, greater US involvement at a more senior level, I think, has shown to be productive at times. I think particularly on the Ethiopia Eritrea file, I think that has had some impact, and you know, holding the main actors' feet to the fire, you know, can be productive, I think. So that would be my very, very broad recommendation.
Thank you. Abdullahi?
Yeah, I think the critical issue here is for the United States to have its eye on what is going on in Ethiopia. It's good to have an Ethiopia policy, and that engagement should be at the senior level. And Addis is desperate to be in the good books of Washington. But I think this delicate dance with no clear direction of travel, which in part was a function of not having many of the senior leadership on the Africa file in place, that is a challenge. But I think the dual approach of the United States trying to deal with Eritrea and, you know, Sudan on the other side and Ethiopia, all these things being done at a bilateral level rather than via the Red Sea would probably bring challenge. But I think the critical one right now, as we get into the lean season, is ensuring that the JOEP is extended. And extension is not enough because it needs to be accompanied by an enforceable anti-diversion mechanism. Food aid in Ethiopia has got a very rich history of diversion. And we saw that in 2023, that large-scale USAID detected diversion that led to suspension. I think that is important to lead to others, especially to have bilateral support. Over to you, Lauren. Thank you again.
Thank you. And Malat.
Thanks, Lauren. I think the biggest thing right now is making sure that a war does not break out. Like, we're talking about a region that survived a war, barely survived, and now is unable to rehabilitate itself from that war, and people are continuing to suffer. You know, as mentioned earlier, budget cuts, fuel resources, etc. Another war will just exacerbate the situation in Tigray. We need members of Congress to urgently push for, you know, de-escalation and language and encircling of the region and using dialogue and diplomacy to resolve issues versus, you know, trying to start another war within the region. But through that, really maybe doing pushing for the State Department to request an assessment of the Pretoria Agreement implementation, to push any conversations with Ethiopia to engage the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement, whether that's through letters or hearing questions to the State Department or even doing a formal accounting of federal Ethiopia's compliance, whether it's through budget transfers, fuel supply, electoral access, and the return of IDPs, and making sure that any future like bilateral engagement is contingent on like the actual measurable implementation of the Pretoria Agreement. As signatories to the Pretoria Agreement, whether that's the TPLF within the Tigray region or that's the Ethiopian government, both making sure to actually make measurable steps forward on the actual implementation of the agreement, and not only stopping the guns, but actually helping to restore the region back from the post-war conditions that it's in. Additionally, we've seen that the State Department is very much aware and in use of using sanctions against leaders within the context of Tigray. We've seen recent sanctions in June coming out, similarly using that same architecture that already exists to put those types of sanctions on those who violated human rights violations, with going as far as like senior leadership that we've talked about that we still haven't seen any accountability for, and then applying them also to Eritrean actors with equal rigor, and making sure that while doing so, like pushing forward for the agreement to come forward, for IDPs to be returned, for human rights to be respected within the context of what we're seeing, and for preventing a future outbreak of war. We need more than just saying we're concerned about a war or concerned about escalating language to actually force these actors into coming to an agreement so that we don't have a potential war looming or happening. And then what we're seeing is also like the involvement of UAE within the context of like Ethiopia, geopolitical situations around Ethiopia. We have satellite images that already link that RSF supply space inside Ethiopia. Having UAE supply links, Ethiopia has been, it's been documented that they're training RSF soldiers. Congress should review the US arms sales to UAE. Members should demand answers on the UAE support for both Addis Ababa and RSF before approving like further transfers, making sure that like strictly focusing on the pressure points so that we use this to make sure that a potential future war can be prevented. And then putting also conditions on IMF and World Bank support that we're seeing. Ethiopia's economic program depends on multilateral financing. So Congress can direct US executive directors to press for restoration of constitutionally mandated regional transfers. We've seen like Tigray hasn't received access to financial support, access to the budget, funds that they're supposed to receive. Civil servants have not been paid, and Ethiopia is receiving a large portion of funding through multilateral funding, so financing. So we need to make sure that there's conditions being put forth so that any funding that's being provided to Ethiopia is with the guise of, are you making sure like you're agreeing to the Pretoria Agreement? Are we making sure that regions are being funded appropriately so that they can be restored back to pre-war conditions and begin their reintegration process within Ethiopian politics and being a part of the Ethiopian populace? Because otherwise the Tigrayan people are going to need to continue depending on further aid when they should be receiving a cut of the budget so that they can work and operate within the context of this country, within Ethiopia. Then also like what we talked about, like 81% of food aid to over 900,000 people is undelivered because fuel can't move in the region. Seeing if we can provide emergency assistance through discontinued US aid support or other types of humanitarian support, that would be another possible method. And another thing that we can maybe have Congress push for is support for an international accountability mechanism. We've had the UN Investigative Commission, who's lapsed in 2023. We should have Congress calling for US support of a successor mechanism to make sure that wartime atrocities and post-2023 atrocities and continued abuses are documented, including what we're currently seeing coming out in recent times through reporting through Human Rights Watch and other agencies. But we need more targeted investigations into what happened in order to hold atrocities and perpetrators accountable and potentially move forward to a better circumstance, at least within the human rights and humanitarian issues that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, for our congressional participants. There are a wide range of options available to you. Always happy to field requests on those options that are out there in terms of oversight of various systems, mechanisms, and policy options. The administration's new global health framework does offer some opportunities for engagement on that front and ensuring equanimity of distribution of U.S. resources, various policy tools that Congress has available. I will also just sort of issue as a reminder, no news out of Ethiopia is not necessarily good news. Multiple conflicts ongoing with little news coming out, including, as one of our participants pointed out, the situation in Oromia, where we've seen forced recruitment, extrajudicial killings, and ongoing communal conflict, I think, driven by the politics of that conflict. And I would say, you know, as Magnus's focus crisis group is focused on sort of averting a return to full-scale conflict in Tigray because of the range of participants that would be included. What we've seen over the years since the Tigray War is that when that conflict is ongoing, we see spikes in forced recruitment in other regions, including Amhara and Oromia, to fight in this war. So what happens in Tigray doesn't stay in Tigray, that's the whole country. And likewise with the other conflicts. With that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks again to Todd and Mark.
Can I just one point, Lauren, because I'm sorry, I might have spoken a little bit longer, and since most of you seem to have a kind of similar concern, which also I share, the concern that war may broke out again involving Tigray. But that concern comes while another war is still waging and we're not paying enough attention to it. And as I increasingly hear this, as much as I very much respect and love the people of Tigray, and I don't want any harm to happen there, but the emphasis only on one aspect of the war is somehow putting a sense of disposability and being unwanted in this type of forums among the Amhara, including myself. And I really resent this sentiment which is created within a lot of Amharas whenever people are coming, talking about the conflict in Ethiopia, the Amhara is always excluded. And I wonder if any of you would have any suggestion, any idea what to happen in relation to the conflict in Amhara, because you have said and recommended so many things about, and genuinely and rightly so, about the conflict in Tigray, whereas much numerous people, 4.4 million Amhara students out of school, up to 22,000 Amharas killed, 950, more than 950 had been injured, and so much atrocities happening under a political ideology that demonizes Amhara. The inability to say a word and utter moral and political sentiment and injecting that into the politics of the day is really troubling. And it's an ongoing message which tells to Amhara that we don't have a place where disposable, no one will listen to us. And the only solutions Amharas have is to find a way for themselves. And I think this is a very dangerous lesson, which your organizations probably or others should really think about, to reconsider the Amhara concerns and voices, which is historical, not started today, but since the Derg period or since 1991. Amharas are represented by amputated hand and breast, and songs and statues exist that demonize Amharas. And I really urge you to help a lot of Amharas not to lose complete hope from the international actors like yourselves, which are trying parts of our people in Ethiopia, and I hope you will do the same in relation to Amhara. And I just want to say that, and with all due respect, and hopefully also preventing the war in Tigray while resolving the actual war that's also happening in Amhara. Thank you.
Thank you, Jurgen. And with that, I think we're 15 minutes over. Apologies to our hosts. Thank you all for joining us today. Much more to discuss. and other parts of the region that we didn't touch on, or the country that we didn't touch on at all. But thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.